Welcome. Tonight our journey takes us back across the centuries to a time of iron and ore, of frost-rimmed coasts, and the glint of steel in the weak northern sun. We are venturing into the world of the Norsemen, a people known to history as Busti. They Vikings. Their name alone conjures images of horned helmets and brutal, merciless raids, of dragon-prowed ships emerging from the sea mist like demons from a forgotten tale. But behind the myth, behind the terror they inspired across Europe, lies a story far more complex and compelling. Ever wondered what drove these fierce warriors to sail across treacherous seas? Join us as we delve into the Viking Age, uncovering the motivations behind their legendary raids and groundbreaking explorations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before the first long ship ever scraped the sands of an English monastery, before the name Viking was ever whispered in fear, there was only the land, Scandinavia, a vast, rugged peninsula at the northern edge of the known world, a place shaped by ice and sea. To understand the explosion of energy that was the Viking Age, we must first understand the world that forged its people. This was not a sudden storm, but a pressure that had been building for centuries in the cold, quiet heart of the North. Imagine the land itself. In the west, the jagged spine of mountains that runs the length of Norway plunges dramatically into the sea, creating the deep, dark-watered inlets known as fjords. These were the highways and harbors of the people who lived there, fingers of the ocean reaching deep into the land, isolating communities in valleys and along narrow coastal strips. Arable land was a precious, hard-won commodity, a small green patch carved from the overwhelming dominance of rock and forest. The sea was not a barrier, it was the lifeblood. It provided food, a means of travel between settlements, and a constant, powerful presence that shaped the worldview of all who lived by its shores. To be a Norseman was to know the sea, to respect its power, and ultimately to learn to master it. To the east, in what would become Sweden and Denmark, the landscape was gentler. Rolling hills, dense forests teeming with game, and more extensive plains allowed for larger agricultural communities. Denmark, a collection of islands and a peninsula, formed a strategic gateway between the Baltic and the North Sea, a crossroads for trade long before the Viking Age. Yet even here, life was dictated by the seasons. The winters were long, dark, and brutally cold. The sun would hang low on the horizon for a few precious hours before plunging the world back into a profound, star-dusted blackness. Survival through these months required foresight, community cooperation, and a deep-seated resilience. It was a life that bred a people who were tough, pragmatic, and accustomed to hardship. The people who inhabited this land were the North Germanic tribes, descendants of those who had migrated into the region thousands of years earlier. By the 8th century, on the cusp of their infamous age, they were far from a unified people. They were a scattered collection of clans and petty chiefdoms, each led by a jarl or a local king. Society was starkly stratified, a pyramid of power and obligation. At the very top were these jarls and chieftains, the warrior aristocracy. Their power was not absolute. It was based on a pact of mutual loyalty with their followers. A jarl had to be generous, a giver of rings, distributing the wealth gained from trade or raids to his herd, his personal retinue of warriors. He had to be successful in battle, wise in judgment, and capable of ensuring the prosperity of his people. Failure in any of these areas could see his power vanish as his followers sought a more promising leader. Below the jarls were the carls, the great mass of the population. These were the free-born farmers, a fiercely independent and proud class. They owned their own land, worked their own farms, and formed the backbone of Norse society. A carl had the right to bear arms, a right he was expected to exercise in defense of his home and in service to his jarl. He could also speak at the local assembly, the Thing. The Thing was a cornerstone of Norse life, an open-air council where free men gathered to settle disputes, enact laws, and make decisions for the community. It was a surprisingly democratic institution for its time, a place where even a powerful jarl had to persuade, not just command. The law was paramount, a complex system of custom and precedent, and a man's honor was tied to his adherence to it. At the bottom of this pyramid were the thralls, the slaves. These were men and women who were captured in raids, were born into bondage, or had fallen into slavery through debt. They had no rights, owned no property, and were the disposable labor that performed the most grueling tasks on the farms and in the households. Thraldom was a brutal reality of the age, and the desire for more thralls would become a powerful motivator for the raids to come. This rigid social structure, however, was not entirely inflexible. A successful warrior, even one of humble birth, could amass wealth and prestige, potentially rising in status. Conversely, a free-born carl could lose his land and his freedom through debt or misfortune. Life was precarious, and status had to be continually defended and asserted. Life itself was centered around the farm and the longhouse. These were not merely homes. They were the economic and social heart of a community. A longhouse was a long, narrow building, often housing not just the farmer's immediate family, but his extended kin and his thralls as well. A central fire pit provided warmth and light, its smoke curling up to a hole in the thatched roof. Benches lined the walls, serving as seats by day and beds by night. In this smoky, dimly lit space, stories were told, deals were made, and the bonds of family and community were forged. It was a life lived in close quarters, where privacy was a foreign concept and the collective was everything. Their worldview, their religion, was a reflection of this harsh and unpredictable world. They worshipped a pantheon of gods who were not gentle or universally benevolent, but were instead powerful, flawed, and deeply human-like in their passions. Odin, the Allfather, was the god of wisdom, poetry, and war, a relentless seeker of knowledge who sacrificed an eye for a drink from the well of wisdom. He was a mercurial, often terrifying figure, the patron of kings and warriors. Then there was Thor, the thunder god, the brawny, red-bearded champion of mankind. With his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, he fought the forces of chaos, the giants who threatened the world of gods and men. He was the common man's god, straightforward, powerful, and protective. And there was Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. yet also a fierce warrior goddess who claimed half of the slain for her own hall. Their cosmology was dominated by the concept of fate, or word. They believed that the destiny of every person, and even the gods themselves, was preordained, woven by the three Norns at the foot of the world tree, Yggdrasil. This was not a passive fatalism, however. While the ultimate outcome might be set, how one met that fate was a matter of personal choice and a measure of one's character. The ideal was to face one's destiny with courage, honor, and a defiant spirit. For a warrior, the ultimate glory was to die in battle. Such a death would earn him a place in Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where he would feast and fight until the day of Ragnarok, the final cataclysmic battle at the end of the world. This belief system created a potent psychological cocktail, a profound acceptance of mortality combined with a burning desire for fame and glory that would outlive death. A man's reputation, the stories told about him after he was gone, was the only true immortality he could achieve. For centuries, this world remained largely self-contained. There was contact with the outside, of course. Norse traders, in their sturdier, broader-beamed trading ships called Nares, plied the waters of the Baltic and the North Sea. They traded furs, amber, walrus ivory, and thralls for Frankish glass, wine, fine cloth, and silver from the Abbasid Caliphate, which found its way north through the great river systems of Russia. They were aware of the wealthy kingdoms to the south, of the glittering churches filled with gold and silver, but the balance of power had not yet shifted. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne was strong, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England were relatively stable. Scandinavia was the periphery, a cold and distant land of pagans. But by the late 8th century, the pressure that had been building began to reach a critical point. Several factors converged to finally unleash the Norsemen upon the world. The first was demographic. The relative peace and a slight warming of the climate had led to a significant population boom. In the constrained geography of the fjords and valleys, this meant more mouths to feed than the limited arable land could support. This was particularly acute for younger sons. Norse inheritance practices, while varied, often favored the eldest son, who would inherit the family farm intact. This left a growing pool of landless, ambitious young men, with little to lose and everything to gain. They had strength, they had been trained in arms since boyhood, but they had no future at home. The sea and the lands that lay beyond it offered the only path to wealth, status, and a life of their own. The second factor was political. Across Scandinavia, powerful chieftains and kings were beginning to consolidate their power, forging larger, more centralized kingdoms. This process was often violent. A jarl who was defeated in a local power struggle, or who refused to bend the knee to a rising king, was faced with a stark choice: submit and lose his independence, or leave. Many chose to leave, taking their loyal followers with them. These exiled chieftains were skilled leaders with military experience, and they needed a new source of income to maintain their retinue and their prestige. The wealthy, poorly defended monasteries and towns to the south were an irresistible target. The third and perhaps most crucial factor was technological. The Norsemen had been refining their shipbuilding skills for centuries. By the late 8th century, they had perfected the vessel that would become the symbol of their age, the Longship. It was a masterpiece of naval engineering, a symphony of form and function. It was long, narrow, and light, with a shallow draft that allowed it to travel far up rivers, striking deep inland where no one expected an attack from the sea. Its clinker-built hull, where the planks overlapped, gave it a unique flexibility, allowing it to bend and ride with the waves of the open ocean rather than fighting against them. Powered by a single large, square sail and banks of oars, it was fast and maneuverable. It could appear seemingly from nowhere, and just as quickly it could vanish back into the sea, laden with treasure and captives long before any local defense could be mustered. The Longship was the key that unlocked the world for the Norsemen. It gave them a mobility and a strategic reach that no other people in Europe possessed. These forces, demographic pressure, political instability, and a revolutionary technological advantage were coalescing. The people of Scandinavia stood at a precipice. They were not ignorant barbarians. They were a complex society on the verge of a dramatic transformation. They were traders, farmers, poets, and lawmakers. But they, were also warriors, forged by a harsh land and a fatalistic creed, who saw no honor in poverty and no future in staying home. The world to the south was rich, divided, and unprepared. All that was needed was a spark to ignite the flame, a single act that would announce their arrival on the world stage, not as traders, but as a terrifying new force. That spark was about to be struck on a small, holy island off the coast of Northumbria. The world before the dragon ships was about to come to a sudden, violent end. To the monks of Lindisfarne, the horror arrived from a world they could not comprehend, a sudden, godless storm from a placid sea. But the storm had been brewing for a century, its pressures building within the deep fjords and dense forests of Scandinavia. The raid on that holy island was not a beginning, but an eruption. It was the moment the lid was finally thrown from a cauldron that had been simmering with a potent brew of demographic strain, political upheaval, and a revolutionary mastery of the sea. To truly understand the Viking, we must look away from the shores of England and gaze deep into that northern cauldron. The first and most fundamental pressure was the most human of all, the cry of a newborn child. For generations, the Scandinavian population had been growing steadily. A slight warming in the climate, a period of relative internal peace, meant more harvests were successful, more children survived infancy, and more families expanded. But the land did not. In the dramatic landscape of Norway in particular, this growth became a crisis. Imagine a family farm, a small patch of green nestled at the base of a towering cliff, its shores washed by the dark, cold waters of a fjord. This farm, the Odal land, was the heart of the family's identity, its wealth and its future. By ancient tradition, it was to be passed down, ideally intact, to the next generation. This meant the eldest son was the anchor, the inheritor of the family's legacy. But what of his brothers? A second son, a third, a fourth? They grew up on that same land, learning its rhythms, their hands calloused from the same work. Yet they knew from an early age that it would never be theirs. They were men without prospects, shadowed by the success of their older sibling. They could remain as farmhands, dependent on their brother's generosity, a future that chafed against the fierce Norse spirit of independence. Or they could seek a new path. They were strong, trained from youth to wield the axe and the shield, skilled in navigating the fjord in a small fishing boat. They possessed all the raw materials of a warrior, but no land to fight for and no inheritance to build upon. They looked out from their narrow valley, and all they saw was the sea. The sea was the only frontier, the only open road in a world of rock and water. It whispered to them of other lands, of shores where a man could carve out his own destiny with the strength of his arm and the courage of his heart. This growing class of landless, ambitious young men became the fuel for the Viking fire. This demographic pressure was intensified by a second parallel force, the violent birth of kingdoms. For centuries, Scandinavia had been a mosaic of petty chiefdoms, a land ruled by local jarls who commanded the loyalty of the farmers and warriors in their immediate vicinity. Power was personal, a delicate balance of generosity, military success, and respect for the law. But by the late 8th and early 9th centuries, a new and more ruthless ambition was taking hold. Certain chieftains, men of immense drive and strategic vision, were no longer content to be first among equals. They sought to become kings in a truer sense, to dominate entire regions, to bend all other jarls to their will. The process was brutal. A rising king would demand tribute and loyalty from his neighbors. A proud jarl, accustomed to his own autonomy, would refuse. The result was war. If the jarl was defeated, his land would be seized, his longhouse burned, his followers scattered, or sworn to the new king. The defeated jarl and his most loyal warriors, his herd, were faced with a stark choice: death, submission, or exile. Many, their pride and honor dictating their actions, chose exile. They took to their ships, becoming sea kings, men without a kingdom, but with a burning desire for revenge and a desperate need for wealth to support their followers. These were not simply landless boys seeking adventure. These were experienced military commanders with a hardened retinue of professional warriors. They were politically dispossessed and highly motivated. They, too, looked to the sea, not just for survival, but for a means to build a new power base, to gather the silver and gold necessary to one day return and reclaim what they had lost. This potent combination of the landless son and the exiled jarl created a vast reservoir of military manpower, a society producing a surplus of warriors. But manpower alone does not launch an age of conquest. The final critical element was the vessel that could carry these ambitions across the open ocean, the longship. The longship was not merely a boat. It was the single most important piece of technology in the Scandinavian world, the culmination of 1,000 years of shipbuilding tradition. It was a weapon, a home, and a symbol all in one. Its genius lay in its unique design. The builders sought out tall, straight oaks, not just for their strength, but for the natural curve of their branches, which could be fashioned into the ribs of the hull. The keel, the ship's backbone, was often carved from a single massive timber. Upon this keel they laid the planks in an overlapping fashion known as clinker construction. Each plank was lashed and riveted to the one below it, and then fastened to the ship's frame. This technique gave the hull a remarkable flexibility. A Mediterranean galley, built with planks fixed edge to edge, was rigid. In a heavy sea, it would shudder and strain, its timbers threatening to split. The longship, by contrast, moved with the water. It would twist and bend its flexible hull, absorbing the immense stress of the North Atlantic waves. It rode upon the water like a living thing. It was long and slender, a predator of the sea, with a ratio of length to width of about 7-1. This sleek profile, combined with a single massive square sail made of wool or linen, made it incredibly fast. When the wind failed or when stealth and maneuverability were required, the sail could be lowered, and the crew would take to the oars. A typical warship might have 16 to 30 pairs of oars, each manned by a single warrior. The rhythm of the oars, the creak of the oarlocks, the commands of the captain. This was the sound of Viking power. The ship was guided not by a central rudder, but by a large steering oar fixed to the right-hand side of the stern, the steerboard side, which gives us our modern word starboard. Perhaps its greatest strategic advantage was its shallow draft. Despite being capable of crossing the open ocean, a longship could float in just a few feet of water. This meant it was not confined to deep water ports. It could navigate far up, shallow rivers appearing hundreds of miles inland, deep in the heart of a kingdom where no attack from the sea was ever thought possible. It could be landed on almost any gentle beach, allowing its crew to disembark, strike, and be gone before any alarm could be raised. It was the ultimate amphibious assault vehicle of its age. The Norsemen lavished attention on their ships, carving their prows into the fearsome heads of dragons and serpents. These were not mere decoration. They were psychological warfare designed to strike terror into their enemies. They were also objects of immense pride and affection. The sagas are filled with the names of famous ships: the Long Serpent, the dragon, the crane, spoken of with the same reverence as a legendary sword. A ship was a man's most valuable possession, the key to his wealth, his fame, and his freedom. When a great chieftain died, he was often buried in his ship, the vessel that had served him in life becoming his transport to the afterlife. And so, the cauldron boiled over. Imagine the scene, repeated in countless fjords along the Scandinavian coast. A group of younger sons, their prospects at home non-existent. An exiled jarl, his face grim, his honor demanding action. They gather at the shore where a newly built longship rests on the water. Its dragon prow seems to sniff the salt air, hungry for the sea. Its builders have done their work. It is strong, flexible, and fast. The warriors load their supplies, dried fish, water, their round shields, their spears, their bearded axes, their swords. There is no map, only the stories of traders who speak of wealthy lands to the south and west, lands where the churches are filled with silver and the kings are weak. The decision to go. Why Viking? To go on an expedition was a conscious choice. It was a seasonal activity, a high-risk, high-reward venture that was part trade, part piracy, and part warfare. It was the ultimate expression of the social, political, and technological forces that had been building for generations. The landless son sought fey, wealth, a way to buy his own farm and his own future. The exiled jarl sought dreary glory and the means to reclaim his power. The ship was the key that unlocked both. As they pushed off from the shore, rowing out of the familiar fjord and into the vast, unknown expanse of the North Sea, they were not just leaving home. They were unleashing an age. The year is 793. On the small, windswept island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, life moves to the gentle, ancient rhythm of prayer. The monks of the priory of St. Cuthbert know little of the world beyond. Their shores. Theirs is a world of illuminated manuscripts, of Latin chants, and of quiet contemplation. They are the keepers of a sacred trust, guardians of the relics of one of England's most beloved saints. Their island is a beacon of learning and Christian piety, a place known throughout Europe as the Holy Island. The sea is their protector, a barrier of divine providence that has kept them safe for over a century. They have no reason to believe that this day, the 8th of June, will be any different. The change, when it comes, is subtle at first. A strange sail on the horizon, then another. They are not the familiar shapes of local fishing boats or the broad-beamed trading cogs that sometimes visit. These are long, slender, moving with an unnatural speed, their prows carved into monstrous heads that seem to skim the waves. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar sensation, begins to flicker in the monastery. The monks gather, watching as the ships turn and make directly for their beach. There is no harbor, but the ships do not need one. They glide into the shallows, there, keels scraping the sand. Tall, fair-haired men, larger than any they have seen before, leap from the vessels, their shouts like the barking of wolves. They carry round shields and wield terrifying, heavy-bladed axes. The terror that followed was absolute. The monks were scholars and scribes, not warriors. They were cut down where they stood, in the cloisters and in the church itself. The raiders moved with a brutal efficiency, their goal not conquest, but loot. They smashed open the chests, tearing the jeweled covers from the holy Gospels. They seized the golden chalices, the silver crosses, the intricately worked reliquaries that held the bones of saints. What they could not carry, they desecrated. They set fire to the wooden buildings. Of the monastery, the smoke a dark plume against the sky. They rounded up the younger monks and boys, chaining them to be taken as slaves. Then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone, their ships pulling away from the burning island, disappearing back into the sea from whence they came. News of the raid on Lindisfarne sent a shock wave of horror through Christendom. This was more than an act of piracy. It was a profound sacrilege. These pagans had dared to defile one of the holiest places in Britain. The scholar Alcuin of York, then at the court of Charlemagne, wrote a letter of lamentation to the king of Northumbria that captured the mood of utter devastation. Never before, he wrote, has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. For Alcuin and his contemporaries, it was as if the forces of Gog and Magog, the harbingers of the apocalypse, had been unleashed from the north. The Viking Age had announced itself to the world with the scream of a terrified monk and the splintering of a church door. Lindisfarne was not an isolated incident. It was the opening salvo of a campaign of terror that would target the soft, wealthy underbelly of Christian Europe, its monasteries. These establishments, often built in deliberately isolated locations to foster quiet contemplation, were the perfect targets. They were undefended, filled with portable wealth, and their inhabitants were unarmed. In the years following Lindisfarne, the litany of raids became a drumbeat of fear. In 794, the Vikings sacked the monastery at Jarrow, the home of the great scholar Bede. In 795, they struck again, this time at the holy island of Iona, off the coast of Scotland, the mother church of the Celtic faith, founded by Saint Columba himself. They would return to Iona again and again in 802 and 806, the last time slaughtering 68 monks, forcing the survivors to flee inland, abandoning their sacred site to the sea-wolves. Ireland, with its long, indented coastline and its multitude of rich, independent monasteries, became a favored hunting ground. The Irish annals, which had for centuries recorded the births and deaths of kings and saints, now began to fill with terse, grim entries. 821. Eitgall of Skellig was carried off by the Heathens, and he died of hunger on board their ship. 824. The pagans plundered Bangor and destroyed the shrine of St. Congal. The Vikings established their first fortified camps, known as Long Forts, on Irish soil, allowing them to overwinter and launch raids deeper into the countryside. The initial shock was giving way to a terrifying new reality. The Northmen were here to stay. The Frankish Empire, the great Christian superpower of the age, was not immune. Under the powerful rule of Charlemagne, the empire's coastlines had been relatively secure. But after his death in 814, his vast realm was divided among his heirs, who soon fell to quarreling and civil war. The Vikings were masterful opportunists, quick to exploit any sign of political division. They began to probe the coasts of Frisia and Francia. They found that the great rivers of Francia, the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, were open highways into a rich and vulnerable heartland. Their first major raid on Francia came in 799 against the monastery of St. Philibert on the island of Noirmoutier, near the mouth of the Loire. Like Lindisfarne, it set a pattern. The monks of Noirmoutier eventually took to digging up the bones of their saint and moving them further and further inland to escape the relentless attacks. Soon, the Vikings were growing bolder, pushing further up the rivers. In 841, they sailed up the Seine and sacked the city of Rouen. In 843, they plundered the wealthy trading town of Nantes on the Loire, slaughtering the city's bishop as he celebrated Mass. These early raids established the classic Viking modus operandi. It was centered on speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. Their primary tactic was the strandhogg or strandhogg, which translates literally as beach hewing. A small fleet of longships would identify a target, land on a nearby beach, and march swiftly overland to strike. The attack would be sudden and overwhelmingly violent. The goal was to create maximum panic in the shortest amount of time. They took what was most valuable and easily transported: precious metals, jewelry, and people. The trade in thralls was immensely profitable, and a healthy captive could fetch a high price in the slave markets of Scandinavia or the wider world. After the raid, they would retreat to their ships and vanish before any organized military response could be marshaled. To the European chroniclers who wrote about them, they were a divine punishment for the sins of their people. They were heathens, pagans, Gentiles. They saw them as a monolithic force of destruction. But in reality, these early raiding parties were small, independent bands. They were the landless sons and the exiled jarls, each operating for their own profit and their own glory. There was no grand strategy, no single king directing their movements. It was a chaotic, entrepreneurial age of violence. They were learning, probing, testing the defenses of the kingdoms to the south. They were discovering just how wealthy these lands were and just how slow their enemies were to react. With each successful raid, their confidence grew. The stories they brought back to Scandinavia, along with the silver and the thralls, inspired others to follow. The trickle of ships leaving the fjords was becoming a flood. This initial phase of hit-and-run raiding was enriching Scandinavia and bleeding Europe, but it was only a prelude. The sea wolves had tasted blood, and their appetite was growing. They were no longer content with merely plundering the coasts. Soon they would come for the kingdoms themselves. For decades, the people of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had grown accustomed to the terror of the Strand Hug. The sight of dragon prows on the horizon meant fire, theft, and bloodshed, a swift and brutal scourge that vanished as quickly as it came. But in the autumn of 865, something different arrived on the shores of East Anglia. This was not a small raiding party of a few ships, come for the plunder of a church or two. This was a fleet, an armada, larger than anything seen before. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in a tone of grim understatement, called its members the Missile. Hyen, here the great heathen army. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. The Viking Age had entered a new and terrifying phase, the age of conquest. The army was a coalition, a grand alliance of several Viking warbands under a unified command. Its leaders were figures who would pass into legend, their names synonymous with Viking terror and ambition. Chief among them were the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. The sagas claimed their invasion was an act of vengeance for the death of their father, supposedly executed by King Glad of Northumbria by being cast into a pit of snakes. While this story provides a powerful narrative of revenge, the army's motivations were far more pragmatic. The rich kingdoms of England were politically fractured and ripe for the taking. The leaders of the great army did not just want to plunder England's wealth. They wanted to seize its land and carve out kingdoms for themselves. This was a turning point. The Vikings were no longer content to be wolves of the sea. They now sought to become masters of the land. They made their first camp in East Anglia, whose nervous king provided them with horses in exchange for a fragile peace. The Vikings had learned a crucial lesson from their earlier raids. Mobility on land was just as important as speed at sea. Now, as a mounted force, they were no longer tied to the coastlines and rivers. They could strike anywhere at any time. In the spring of 866, they rode north, their target the kingdom of Northumbria, the very land where the Viking Age had begun with the raid on Lindisfarne. Northumbria was embroiled in a bitter civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, Osbert and Gley. They were so focused on their internal squabble that they failed to recognize the true threat until it was too late. On the 1st of November, the great army seized the kingdom's greatest city, the former Roman fortress of Eoforwic, which they would rename Jorvik. The two rival Northumbrian kings, in a moment of sheer desperation, put aside their differences and joined forces to try and retake the city. In March of 867, they launched an assault. It was a disaster. The Vikings, feigning a retreat, lured the Northumbrian forces through a breach in the city walls and then turned on them, slaughtering them in the narrow streets. Both King Osbert and King Gley were killed. The sagas tell a grisly tale of Gley's capture and subsequent execution by the Blood Eagle, a horrific ritual execution. While the historical accuracy of this specific event is debated, the outcome was undeniable. The kingdom of Northumbria had been shattered. The great heathen army had decapitated its leadership and conquered the largest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In a single campaign, they installed a puppet English king to govern for them and collect taxes, while Jorvik became their capital, a bustling hub of Viking power and commerce in the heart of England. With the north secured, the army turned its attention south. In 869, they marched back into East Anglia. This time there would be no negotiated peace. The East Anglian king, Edmund, raised his forces to fight the invaders. He was defeated, captured, and then, according to tradition, martyred for his faith. The legend states that the Vikings tied him to a tree and demanded he renounce Christ. When he refused, they scourged him, used him for target practice with their bows, and finally beheaded him. His death earned him sainthood, but it marked the end of East Anglia as an independent kingdom. It was now Viking land. Next in their sights was Mercia, the great central kingdom that had once dominated Anglo-Saxon England. In 870, the army moved on Mercia, seizing the royal center of Repton. They established a winter camp there. Their presence, announced by a massive defensive ditch and the desecration of the local monastery, the burial place of Mercian kings. The Mercian king, Burgard, was overwhelmed. He tried to buy them off, but the army was relentless. By 874, his kingdom was broken. Burgard fled into exile, dying a broken man in Rome. The Vikings split Mercia in two, keeping the eastern half for themselves and setting up another puppet king in the west. In less than a decade, 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were no more. Only one kingdom remained, standing alone against the tide, its back to the sea. This was the kingdom of Wessex, ruled by a young king named Alfred. Wessex was now the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance. Alfred was a different kind of king. He was not just a warrior. He was a scholar, a man of deep piety and intellect. He understood that the Vikings were not a temporary scourge, but a mortal threat to the existence of his people and his faith. He knew that to fight them, he would have to learn from them and adapt. The struggle for Wessex became a desperate, brutal affair. In January 871, a year of 6 major battles, Alfred and his brother, the King Thellard, met a Viking army at the Battle of Ashdown. The battle raged all day, a desperate struggle on a chalk ridge. Alfred led a charge, as the chronicle says, like a wild boar, and against the odds the West Saxons were victorious. But the victory was costly and temporary. Thellard died shortly after, and Alfred, at just 21 years of age, became king of a realm on the verge of annihilation. For years, Alfred fought a desperate holding action, paying off the Vikings when he had to, fighting them when he could. But the pressure was relentless. In January 878, the Vikings, now under the command of the warlord Guthrum, launched a surprise winter attack. They swarmed into Wessex, scattering Alfred's forces. They overran the royal estate at Chippenham while Alfred was celebrating Christmas. The king himself was forced to flee, becoming a fugitive in his own kingdom. With a small band of loyal followers, he retreated into the swamps and marshes of the Somerset levels, finding refuge on the small island of Athelney. This was the lowest point for Anglo-Saxon England. Its last king was in hiding, its armies shattered. It seemed that the Viking conquest was complete, but in the marshy wilderness, Alfred did not despair. He planned. He gathered his strength, sending out messengers to the loyal men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. He was forging a new kind of army and a new kind of kingdom. It was during this period that the famous legend of Alfred and the Cakes arose. The story of the fugitive king taking shelter in a peasant woman's hut, being so preoccupied with his troubles that he let her cakes burn and earned a scolding for his carelessness. The story, though likely apocryphal, captures a profound truth. Alfred was a king brought low, a man who had lost everything but his resolve. In the spring of 878, he emerged from the marshes. The men of Wessex rallied to their king at a rendezvous point known as Egbert's Stone. The army Alfred now led was not just fighting for a king. They were fighting for their homes, their faith, and their very existence. He marched to meet Guthrum's army at a place called Edington. The battle that followed was not merely a battle for Wessex, but for the future of England. Alfred's men formed a solid shield wall, and for hours they withstood the Viking assaults. Then they advanced, pushing the Vikings back, their resolve, finally breaking the Northmen's spirit. The Viking army shattered and fled, with the remnants holding up in their fortress at Chippenham. Alfred besieged them for 2 weeks, until starvation forced Guthrum to surrender. But Alfred's victory was not just military, it was political and psychological. He did not execute Guthrum. Instead, he made him an offer. He would recognize Guthrum as the king of East Anglia, but Guthrum and his chief men must accept baptism into the Christian faith, with Alfred himself standing as godfather. Guthrum agreed. This was a masterstroke of statesmanship. Alfred could not drive the Vikings out of England. They were too numerous, too deeply entrenched. But by forcing Guthrum to accept baptism, he had brought him into his own world, bound him by oaths, and symbolically asserted the superiority of the Christian God over the pagan pantheon. He had neutralized the leader of the great army and created a new political reality. A treaty was formalized, establishing a boundary that ran from the Thames up the River Lee to Bedford, and then along the old Roman road of Watling Street. To the north and east of this line was the territory of the Vikings, which would become known as the Danelaw. To the south and west was Alfred's Wessex and English Mercia. The great heathen army had not been destroyed, but it had been contained. It had succeeded in conquering half of England, but it had failed to conquer it all. The war was not over, but the tide had turned. Out of the crucible of the Viking invasion, Alfred had saved his kingdom. In doing so, he had laid the foundations for a new, unified nation, a nation that would one day be called England. While Alfred the Great fought for the very soul of his kingdom in England, the other half of the Viking storm had broken upon the lands of the Franks. The mighty empire forged by Charlemagne was now a house divided against itself, a fractured realm ripe for exploitation. His grandsons had carved the empire into three pieces: West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia, and were perpetually locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy. For the Vikings, this internal strife was an open invitation. They saw not kingdoms, but opportunities. The great rivers of Francia, the Scheldt, the Meuse, the Loire, and, above all, the Seine were not barriers, but highways that led directly into the wealthy, to the wealthy, feuding heart of the continent. The Frankish experience of the Vikings evolved in the same way as the English one, from swift coastal raids to something far more permanent and menacing. The Vikings quickly realized that by establishing fortified bases at the mouths of these great rivers, they could transform their strategy. There were no longer seasonal raiders who had to return to Scandinavia for the winter. They could now stay, creating permanent footholds from which to launch campaigns year-round. They built camps on islands like Noirmoutier at the mouth of the Loire and Oisel on the Seine. These bases became their own grim micro-societies, part military barracks, part slave market, and part shipyard, where they could repair their ships and plan their next move. From these camps they became the River Kings. Their long ships, with their shallow draft, allowed them to penetrate deep into the Frankish heartland. They rode past fields and vineyards, past towns and monasteries that had never known the fear of an attack from the sea. Their movements became terrifyingly predictable in their unpredictability. They would sail up one river, plunder a region, and then, using the ancient Roman road networks, they would drag their ships over land to another river system, appearing suddenly where they were least expected. The Frankish kings, distracted by their own wars, were largely powerless to stop them. They lacked effective navies, and their slow-moving infantry armies could never hope to catch the swift-moving Northmen. Often their only recourse was to pay the Vikings to leave. This was the infamous Danegeld. A king would levy a tax on his subjects to raise a vast sum of silver, which he would then hand over to the Viking leaders in exchange for a promise to depart. But the Danegeld was a fatal strategy. It was a short-term solution that created a long-term disaster. It taught the Vikings two things. First, that the Franks were weak and afraid, and second, that Frankish silver was easier to obtain through extortion than through fighting. Each payment only guaranteed that the Vikings would return, their demands escalating each time. It was a cycle of protection money that was draining the kingdoms dry and emboldening their tormentors. The Vikings had found the great weakness of the Carolingian Empire. It was rich, it was divided, and it was willing to pay for peace. The Seine became the main artery of the Viking assault on West Francia. It led to some of the richest targets, including the great city of Paris. In 845, a Viking fleet led by a chieftain named Reginharus, perhaps an early version of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, sailed up the Seine with over 100 ships. They sacked Rusing and advanced on Paris. The West Frankish king, Charles the Bald, assembled an army to meet them, but in a disastrous decision, he divided his forces on either side of the river. The Vikings simply annihilated one half of the army in full view of the other, which then melted away in terror. The Vikings entered Paris unopposed. They plundered the city's abbeys and churches. Charles the Bald, to save his city from being burned to the ground, resorted to the only tool. he had left. He paid a staggering Danegeld of 7,000 pounds of silver. The Vikings, their ships laden with treasure, sailed away, content with their earnings. They had learned the route to Paris and the price of its safety. For the next 40 years, the pattern repeated itself across Francia. But in 885, the Vikings returned to Paris with an ambition that dwarfed all previous endeavors. This was not a raid for gold. This was an assault aimed at breaking the back of West Francia for good. It was led by the chieftains Siegfried and Senric, and with them came a fleet of such staggering size that it beggared belief. The monk Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, an eyewitness to the events, wrote that the fleet consisted of some 700 ships, not including smaller vessels. He claimed, "The river was so choked with ships for 2 leagues that one could not even see the water." His numbers may be an exaggeration born of terror, but there is no doubt that this was the largest Viking fleet ever assembled on the continent, carrying an army of perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 warriors. They arrived before Paris in November of 885, demanding their customary tribute. This time, however, they were refused. The Paris of the 9th century was not the sprawling metropolis of today. It was concentrated on an island in the middle of the Seine, the Isle de la Cite. This island was fortified with a stone wall, a legacy of the Romans. Crucially, its access to the mainland was controlled by 2 fortified bridges, one to the north and one to the south. These bridges were the key to the city's defense. The commander of Paris was Count Odo, a man of immense courage and determination, ably assisted by Bishop Goslin. They had only a few hundred professional soldiers to defend the city against a vast Viking host. When the Viking demand for tribute was rejected, Siegfried gave the order to attack. The great siege of Paris had begun. The Vikings threw everything they had at the city's defenses. They launched a massive frontal assault on the northern bridge tower, which was still under construction and not yet completed in stone. Their warriors rushed forward under a hail of arrows and stones from the defenders. They brought up siege engines, catapults, and battering rams. The defenders fought back with ferocious determination. Bishop Goslin, despite his clerical robes, fought on the ramparts, planting a cross on the battlements as a standard. Count Odo was everywhere, a whirlwind of action, rallying his men, leading counterattacks, his courage inspiring the beleaguered garrison. The initial Viking assault was beaten back with heavy losses. The siege ground on through the winter. The Vikings, masters of siegecraft, tried new tactics. They filled barges with flammable material and sent them down the river to try and burn the bridges. They tried to undermine the bridge towers by digging tunnels. The Parisians fought back with equal ingenuity, launching their own raids on the Viking camp. But as the months wore on, conditions inside the city grew desperate. Food ran out. Disease began to spread. The heroic Bishop Goslin himself fell sick and died. Yet Odo and his men refused to surrender. They held on, praying for the arrival of the imperial army. The emperor at this time was Charles the Fat, a man who, through a series of dynastic accidents, had briefly reunited most of Charlemagne's old empire. He had a reputation for indecisiveness and lethargy, but the plight of Paris finally spurred him to action. In the summer of 886, after nearly a year of siege, the imperial army finally arrived. A huge Frankish relief force appeared on the hills, overlooking the Viking camp. The exhausted defenders on the walls of Paris cheered, believing their salvation was at hand. They expected a great battle, a final, decisive confrontation that would crush the invaders. But Charles the Fat did not fight. He looked at the vast, entrenched Viking army and lost his nerve. Instead of giving the order to attack, he opened negotiations with the Viking leaders. The deal he struck was met with universal disgust by the defenders of Paris. He agreed to pay the Vikings a danegeld of 700 pounds of silver to leave the city. And in a final act of ignominy, because the Parisians still refused to let the Vikings pass through their city, Charles gave the Viking army permission to sail further up the Seine and winter in Burgundy, which was then in revolt against him, effectively unleashing the predators on another part of his own kingdom. Count Odo was furious. He and his men had held the city for a year through starvation and death, only to be betrayed by their emperor. They refused the deal, but their stand was symbolic. The emperor had made his decision. The Vikings took their silver, bypassed Paris, and went on to ravage Burgundy. The siege was over, but it left a bitter legacy. Charles the Fat's cowardice and incompetence proved to be the final straw for the Frankish nobility. He was deposed the following year, and the Carolingian Empire, shattered for the last time, never to be reunited. The hero of the siege, Count Odo, was elected by the nobles as the new king of West Francia. The siege marked a turning point. It had shown that the Vikings, for all their strength, could be stopped by determined leadership and well-defended fortifications. But it had also fatally exposed the weakness of the old imperial system. The age of great empires was ending, and a new age, the age of localized defense and feudal loyalties, was being born from the crucible of the Viking onslaught. While the monasteries of England and the towns of Francia trembled at the sight of dragon prows, another parallel Viking world was unfolding to the east. This was a world not of open ocean, but of endless forests, winding rivers, and vast, empty spaces. It was a world not primarily of raiding, but of trade, extortion, and ultimately the forging of an empire. The Vikings who turned their ships eastward were known by different names. In the annals of the Slavs and Byzantines they were the Rus in the emperor's own guard. They were the Varangians, but their ambition was born of the same Scandinavian crucible. Yet their path would lead them not to the destruction of old kingdoms, but to the creation of a new one. The eastern expansion was primarily the domain of the Swedes. From their great trading centers like Birka and Gotland, they looked not across the stormy North Sea, but across the calmer, more contained waters of the Baltic. Beyond that lay a continent veined with rivers, a network of natural highways that could lead a determined man all the way to the wealthiest cities on earth. These were not the short, fast-flowing rivers of Francia, but immense, slow-moving giants. Two great river systems beckoned: the Volga, which snaked its way southeast to the Caspian Sea and the markets of the powerful Abbasid Caliphate, and the Dnieper, which flowed south across the steppes into the Black Sea, leading directly to the gates of the greatest city in the Christendom, Constantinople. The journey was an epic in itself, a testament to Norse stamina and ingenuity. Their longships, so perfect for the open ocean and coastal raids, were not ideal for this new challenge. They adapted using vessels that could handle the long and arduous journey. For months, they would row and sail through a landscape of dense, primal forest inhabited by scattered Finnic and Slavic tribes. This was a wilderness that could swallow an army. The most daunting challenge was the portage, where the river systems did not connect or where impassable rapids blocked the way. The Russ would haul their ships from the water. They would cut down trees to use as rollers, and with brute strength they would drag their heavy vessels for miles over land through mud and forest until they reached the next navigable waterway. It was a colossal undertaking, a feat of logistics and sheer willpower that no other people of the age would have dared attempt. Their goals were also different. While Western Vikings sought gold, silver, and land, the Eastern Russ were merchants. First and foremost, they came seeking the raw materials of the north, the luxurious furs of the marten, the fox, and the sable, which were in high demand in the courts of Baghdad and Constantinople. They traded in honey, wax, and fine northern, walrus ivory, and they traded in people. They were relentless slavers, their raids on the local Slavic tribes providing a steady supply of captives, the Sakaliba, as they were known in the Arab world, who were sold in the markets of the south. In return for these goods, they received what they craved above all else: silver. The discovery of tens of thousands of Arab silver coins, known as dirhams, in hordes all across Scandinavia is stark evidence of the scale and success of this eastern trade. For a time, the silver of the Caliphate, flowing up the Volga, was the primary economic engine of the entire Viking world. These merchant warriors established a series of fortified trading posts along the rivers to protect their trade routes and to dominate the local tribes. From places like Aldigeborg and later Novgorod in the north and Kiev further south, they operated a sophisticated protection racket. The Arab diplomat and traveler Ibn Fadlan, who met the Russ on the Volga in the early 10th century, left a vivid, if horrified, account of them. He described them as perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, with bodies covered in intricate tattoos. He found them crude, filthy, and utterly terrifying, but he also noted their commercial focus. They were here for business, a violent and brutal form of business, but business nonetheless. Over time, this commercial enterprise began to evolve into something more political. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, a 12th century history of the region, the Slavic and Finnic tribes, weary of their own internal conflicts, took a fateful step. They sent a message across the sea to the Russ, saying, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." In response, in the year 862, a Varangian chieftain named Rurik and his two brothers, Cineas and Truver, supposedly answered the call. They came not just to trade, but to rule. Rurik established himself in Novgorod, laying the foundation stone of what would become the first Russian state. While the historical accuracy of this specific invitation is debated, the underlying truth is clear. The Rus chieftains, with their superior military organization and cohesive warbands, began to impose their rule over the Slavic tribes, transforming themselves from traders into a ruling aristocracy. After Rurik's death, his kinsman Oleg pushed south, capturing the strategic trading post of Kiev. He declared it the mother of all Rus cities, and from this new capital he forged a powerful state, the Kievan Rus. This was a hybrid entity, a Slavic land ruled by a Norse elite who, over generations, would adopt the language, customs, and eventually the religion of their subjects, but who would never forget their Scandinavian origins, the ultimate prize on. The Dnieper route was the city the Norse called Miklagard, that great city, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. To the Rus, it was a place of almost mythical wealth and power. Their relationship with the Byzantines was a complex dance of aggression and commerce. They launched a series of audacious full-scale naval assaults on the city. In 860, a Rus fleet appeared suddenly before the walls while the emperor and his army were away fighting the Arabs. They ravaged the suburbs, creating a panic within the city before withdrawing. In 907, Oleg led another massive attack, a campaign so terrifyingly successful that the legend claims he beached his ships and fitted them with wheels, sailing over the land to the city gates. The terrified Byzantines sued for peace, but these raids were not attempts at conquest. They were a violent and spectacular form of negotiation. The aftermath of each attack was not destruction, but a treaty. The Rus, by demonstrating their military power, were able to extract incredibly favorable trade agreements from the Byzantine emperors. They were granted their own quarter in the city, given tax-free trading rights, and supplied with provisions for their return journey. They had kicked in the door of the world's greatest economic power and forced it to become their business partner. The Byzantines, for their part, were both wary and impressed. They saw in these fierce northern warriors an unparalleled martial spirit. Rather than constantly fighting them, the emperors decided to hire them. This led to the formation of the most elite and famous mercenary unit of the age, the Varangian Guard. This was the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. To be a member was to hold one of the most prestigious and lucrative positions in the known world. Ambitious young men from all over Scandinavia, including famous figures like Harald Hardrada, who would one day be king of Norway, traveled the river road to Miklagard to seek their fortune. Serving in the guard was a path to immense wealth and prestige. A Varangian guardsman was paid a handsome salary, but the real prize came upon the death of an emperor. The guard had the right to pillage the palace, legally taking a vast amount of portable wealth from the imperial treasury. A man who completed his service could return to Iceland or Norway a fabulously wealthy and respected figure. They were utterly loyal, not to the person of the emperor, but to the throne itself. Their loyalty was legendary, as they had no stake in the complex and treacherous court politics of Byzantium. Their only duty was to protect the emperor. They fought for him across the empire, from Sicily to Anatolia, their great double-bitted. Acts as a symbol of terror and discipline, the Eastern Road transformed the Vikings. It turned them from raiders and traders into state builders and kingmakers. They laid the foundations of a future empire and tied the destiny of Eastern Europe to the great civilizations of the South. The flow of men, goods, and ideas along the river roads created a vibrant, violent, and dynamic world that reshaped the map of Europe. The Varangian who returned home, his pockets heavy with gold from the emperor's service, was a world away from the landless son who had first set out. He had seen the world, served in its greatest city, and helped build a new kingdom. He was living proof that the Viking spirit was not just about destruction. It was also about creation. While the Rus were navigating the labyrinthine rivers of the East, another great Viking saga was being written on the vast, empty canvas of the North Atlantic. This was not a story of trade with ancient empires or the conquest of settled kingdoms. This was a story of pure exploration, of a people pushing out into the terrifying, unknown void, driven not just by a lust for wealth, but by a hunger for land and a fierce, unyielding desire for freedom. It was a journey into the heart of the ocean, a testament to the most advanced navigational skills of the age, and a gamble that would take the Norsemen to the very edge of the world. The catalyst for this westward explosion was, ironically, the unification of Norway. In the late 9th century, a powerful and ruthless king, Harald Fairhair, embarked on a campaign to become the sole ruler of all of Norway. He crushed his rival jarls, imposed heavy taxes, and seized the traditional family lands, the Odel farms, declaring them crown property. For many proud, independent chieftains and free farmers, this was an intolerable tyranny. They were faced with a choice: bend the knee to this new king and live as his subjects, or leave. For a Viking whose identity was so deeply tied to his freedom and his land, there was only one real choice. They looked to the west, to the open sea, which offered a final refuge from the grasp of a King Dot. So began a great exodus. But to sail into the open Atlantic was to sail off the edge of the map. They had no compasses, no astrolabes, no modern instruments of any kind. Their navigation was a subtle art, a deep intimacy with the natural world. Their primary tool was the sun. They may have used a simple sun compass, a marked disk that could cast a shadow to help maintain a bearing. And they had the legend of the Solarstein, the Sunstone, a polarizing crystal like cordierite, which is found in Scandinavia. In theory, by holding this stone up to the sky, a navigator could detect the direction of the sun even through heavy fog or cloud cover, a common condition in the North Atlantic, but their skills went far beyond any single tool. They were masters of dead reckoning. They knew how to maintain a steady speed and direction, calculating their position based on how long they had traveled. They understood the signs of the ocean. They could read the color and temperature of the water, the patterns of the waves, and swells to know if they were in deep ocean or approaching a coastline. They were keen observers of wildlife. They knew the flight patterns of seabirds, recognizing species that only flew a certain distance from land. A sighting of a gannet or a guillemot told them that land was near, even when it was invisible. They followed the migration routes of whales, the great sea-stallions, knowing these animals moved between feeding grounds often located in nutrient-rich waters close to shore. This was not science as we know it, but a deep, traditional knowledge, passed down through generations, a conversation with the ocean itself, and they had the right vessel for the job. While the longship was the perfect warship, the workhorse of Atlantic colonization was the Nair. The Nair was shorter, wider, and deeper than a longship. It was less a predator and more a beast of burden. It was slower and less maneuverable, but it was far more stable in heavy seas and could carry an immense amount of cargo. A family emigrating from Norway would load their Nair with everything they owned, their livestock, sheep, cattle, goats, and horses, their tools, their preserved food, their household goods, and their dependents. These ships were the covered wagons of the Atlantic, carrying the seeds of a new society westward. The first major discovery on this westward path was an accident. A Norwegian named Nadad, sailing to the Faroe Islands, was caught in a storm and blown far off course. He made landfall on a vast, mountainous, uninhabited coast. Seeing snow on the mountains, he named it Snyland or Snowland. A few years later, a Swedish Viking named Gardar Svavarsson circumnavigated the landmass, confirming it was an island. But it was a third voyager, Floki Vilgerharson, who gave the island its permanent, forbidding name. In a brilliant piece of navigational pioneering, Floki took 3 ravens with him. After sailing for some time, he released the first. It flew back towards the Faroe Islands. Later, he released the second, which circled aimlessly and returned to the ship. The third raven, released last, flew purposefully northwest. Floki followed it and found his way to the new land. He and his party suffered through a harsh winter, and looking out at a fjord filled with drift ice, he christened the land island Iceland. Despite its discouraging name, Iceland became the primary destination for those fleeing Harald Fairhair's rule. The first permanent settler was Ingolfur Arnarsson. In a deeply symbolic act, as he approached the coast, he threw his high-seat pillars, the carved wooden posts that flanked the chieftain's seat in his longhouse and were a powerful symbol of his authority and family heritage overboard. He vowed he would build his farm wherever the gods washed them ashore. He made a temporary landing, but it took his thralls 3 years to find the pillars, which had washed ashore in a bay steaming with geothermal vents. He named the place Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, and it would become the future capital. What the settlers created in Iceland was unique in world history. This was a large, empty land where they could begin anew, and they did so without a king. They brought with them their legal traditions and their love for assemblies, and on this new soil they perfected them. In 930, the chieftains of Iceland established the Alþingi, or Althing, a national assembly that met for 2 weeks every summer in a spectacular natural amphitheater of lava rock called Linvillr. Here, in the open air, the free men of Iceland gathered to have laws recited, to settle disputes, and to make decisions for the Commonwealth. It was not a democracy in the modern sense, but an aristocratic republic, a society founded not on the authority of a king, but on the supremacy of the law. It was this deeply legalistic and story-rich culture that would later produce the sagas, the great prose epics that preserve the memory of the Viking Age for all time. But the Norse spirit of exploration was restless. Even the vastness of Iceland was not enough. The sagas tell of a man named Eric the Red, a personality as fiery and turbulent as his hair. He was born in Norway, but his father was exiled for manslaughter, so the family settled in Iceland. Eric, however, inherited his father's temper. He became embroiled in a feud and was exiled from Iceland for 3 years. Like so many Vikings before him, he chose to turn his punishment into an opportunity. He had heard rumors of a vast landmass even further to the west. With a small crew, he set out to find it. For 3 years he explored the coast of this new land. He found a landscape harsher than Iceland, dominated by a colossal ice cap, but with habitable fjords on its southwestern coast that were, for a short time in summer, green and suitable for grazing. His term of exile over, he returned to Iceland to recruit settlers to join him in this new colony. He was a master of marketing. He called the new territory Greenland, because, as the saga dryly notes, people would be more attracted to go there if it had a good name. The trick worked. In 985, Eric led a fleet of 25 nares filled with colonists and their livestock out of Iceland. Only 14 survived the perilous journey, but with them, Eric established the first European settlements. In Greenland, the eastern and western settlements. Life in Greenland was life on a razor's edge. The colonists clung to a fragile existence in the fjords, surrounded by an immensity of ice and rock. They tried to live as they had in Iceland and Norway as pastoral farmers, but their survival ultimately depended on the resources of the Arctic. They hunted seals for meat and clothing, and caribou for their hides. Their most vital export, the commodity that kept them connected to Europe, was walrus ivory. Walrus tusks and rope made from their hides were a precious luxury in Europe, and the Greenlanders traded them for the iron, grain, and timber they could not produce themselves. For nearly 500 years, this small, tenacious community of Norse farmers and hunters survived the most remote outpost of Europe. They had pushed their way of life to the absolute limit of the habitable world. They stood on the shores of Greenland, looking west at the very edge of the map. The next step would take them into a new world. The settlement of Greenland was the ultimate expression of the Norse will to survive, a society clinging to the very edge of the map. The Greenlanders were the most isolated of all Europeans, a lonely outpost in a world of ice and sea. But the spirit of exploration that had carried them so far was not yet extinguished. It lay dormant, waiting for a spark. They stood on the shores of their new home, looking west into the unknown, unaware that they were on the precipice of their most extraordinary discovery, a final sun-struck chapter in their Atlantic saga that would take them into a new world entirely. This final voyage would not be driven by the flight from a king, but by the purest forms of Viking ambition, curiosity, chance, and the lure of a good story. The story begins not with a deliberate quest, but with a mistake. It begins with a young merchant named Badni Herjolfsson in the year 986. Badni was a man of routine, not adventure. His life was a predictable triangle of trade between Norway, his home in Iceland, and the new Greenland colony where his father had recently emigrated. That summer he set sail from Iceland to join his parents in Greenland, his nare loaded with goods. But the North Atlantic is a fickle master. A dense fog descended, followed by a ferocious storm from the north that blew for many days. Bjarni and his crew were hopelessly lost. They had no sun to guide them, no stars to read. They were adrift in the gray, featureless void. When the storm finally broke and the sun reappeared, they saw land. But it was not the land they were looking. For Bodney knew from descriptions that Greenland had massive glaciers. The coast before them was low-lying, covered not with ice, but with thick, unfamiliar forests. His crew, excited and curious, begged him to go ashore and explore. But Bodney was a practical man, a trader, not an explorer. His goal was to reach his father's farm, not to chart new worlds. He refused to land. He turned his ship north, sailing, with the unknown coast to his port side. 2 days later they saw land again. It was flat and heavily wooded. Again he refused to land. He sailed on. After another 3 days they sighted a third land, this one high and mountainous, with its own glaciers. It was closer to the description of Greenland, but still not right. He did not stop. Finally, after 4 more days of hard sailing, they arrived, miraculously, at the very settlement in Greenland where his father lived. Bjarni's story became a sensation in the small, close-knit Greenland community. He was both praised for his skill in bringing his crew home safely and criticized for his lack of curiosity. He had glimpsed a new world, but had not bothered to set foot on it. The lands he described, lands of timber and forests, were a tantalizing prospect to the Greenlanders who lived in a world where wood was so scarce it had to be scavenged as driftwood. The story simmered for years, a tale told around the fire during the long, dark winters, until it captured the imagination of the one man with the ambition and the resources to act upon it. Leif Erikson, the son of Greenland's founder, Erik, the Red Dot Leif was the very opposite of Bjarni Herjolfsson. He was his father's son, bold, charismatic, and hungry for fame. Around the year 1000, he decided he would not let Bjarni's accidental discovery remain a mere footnote. He bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and planned a voyage of intentional exploration. His plan was simple and logical. He would retrace Bjarni's route in reverse, seeking out the lands the merchant had only glimpsed from the sea. Sailing west from Greenland, the first shore they reached was the last one Bjarni had seen. It was a forbidding landscape of rock and ice. Great glaciers gleamed inland, and the land from the sea to the ice was like one continuous flat stone. There was no grass, no life. Leif, recognizing that it was useless for settlement but important to chart, went ashore and gave it a name. He called it Helgeland, the land of flat stones. Today we know it as Baffin Island. He pushed south. The next land they found corresponded to Bjarni's second sighting. Here the coast was low and covered in vast, dense forests, with shores of white sand that stretched for miles. This was a place of immense value. For a Greenlander, a forest was a treasure chest. Timber for building ships, houses, and for fuel was the foundation of their entire economy. Leif named this place Markland, the land of forests. It was likely the coast of modern-day Labrador. They had found the resource that could secure the future of their Greenland colony. But Leif was not yet satisfied. He sailed on, driven by the promise of the third land Bjarni had seen, the first and most mysterious of them all. After 2 more days at sea, a northeast wind pushed them to a new shore. They came to an island that lay to the north of the mainland, and sailed into a channel between the island and a cape that pointed north. The land here was different. It was lusher, greener, and more temperate than anything they had ever known. The dew on the grass seemed sweet to the taste. They found a river that flowed from a lake out into the sea, and the river was so thick with salmon that they were larger than any salmon they had ever seen or heard of. The climate felt remarkably mild. There was no frost in the winter, and the grass barely withered. In this northern world, where the length of a day was a matter of survival, they noted that on the shortest day of the year, the sun was still above the horizon in the mid-afternoon. They had come to a land of plenty. Leif decided this was the place to build a base. He ordered his men to construct a series of large houses, a small settlement that became known as Life's Buffer or Life's Booths. They would overwinter here and explore the surrounding country. It was during this exploration that the land received its famous name. One of Leif's crew, a German man named Tyrker, whom Leif had known since childhood, went missing. Leif, distressed, sent out a search party. They found Tyrker in a state of high excitement, babbling in German, his eyes rolling. When he finally calmed down enough to speak Norse, he explained that he had found grapevines and grapes. For Tyrker, who had grown up in the wine-producing regions of the Rhine, this was a startling and wonderful discovery. In his excitement, Leif Erikson named this new country Vinland, the land of wine. The name has been a source of endless debate. Were these truly grapes growing so far north? It is possible. Wild grapes do grow in coastal New England. But another interpretation hinges on the double meaning of the Old Norse word vang. While it can mean wine, it can also mean pasture or meadow. It is possible that Leif named it not for the grapes, but for the rich green pastures that would have been so valuable for grazing livestock. Perhaps the name was a clever double entendre. Vinland the Good, a land of both pastures and vines, a paradise for Norse farmers. After a winter of exploration and loading their ship with timber and preserved grapes, Leif and his crew sailed for home, their voyage a staggering success. Leif never returned to Vinland. His father, Eric, died shortly after his return, and Leif inherited the chieftainship of the Greenland colony, his duties now keeping him at home. But the story of Vinland, this new world of warmth and resources, ignited a fire of colonial ambition. Leif's brother Thorvald led the next expedition. He and his crew successfully navigated to Leif's Buffer and spent 2 years exploring the new land. But it was on this voyage that the Vikings made a fateful discovery. They were not alone. One day they came across 3 strange skin-covered boats, and under them 9 men were sleeping. The Vikings, in a tragically typical act of preemptive violence, attacked them. They killed 8, but 1 escaped. The consequences were swift. A fleet of skin boats emerged from a nearby fjord and attacked Thorvald's ship. The natives, whom the Norse called Skrællingar, a derogatory term that might mean screamers or wretches, unleashed a storm of arrows. One of those arrows found its mark, striking Thorvald under the arm. As he lay dying, he instructed his men to bury him there on a headland and call it Crossain's Crossness. He would be the first European to be buried in the soil of the New World. The most determined attempt at colonization was led by an Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni. His was not a small expedition, but a full-fledged colonial venture, involving 3 ships, over 160 people, including women and livestock. Among the colonists was Karlsefni's wife, Gudrid Thorbjornsdottir, a remarkable woman who was at the heart of the Vinland voyages. They settled, possibly at Leif's Buffer, and in their first year, Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri, the first European child born in the Americas. At first, their interactions with the Skrællingar were peaceful. They established a silent trade, exchanging red cloth and milk for valuable furs. But the relationship was fragile. It shattered when a bull from the Norse herd broke loose and terrified the natives. Mistrust turned to hostility, and a battle ensued. Though the Vikings, with their iron weapons, were formidable fighters, they were unnerved by the sheer number and ferocity of the Skrillingar. After 3 winters, facing dwindling supplies and the relentless pressure of a hostile native population, Karlsefni made the difficult decision to abandon the colony. The dream of Vinland was over. The reasons for its failure were starkly practical. The colony was simply too far away. The supply lines back to Greenland were long and treacherous. The number of Norse colonists was pitifully small, and most decisively, unlike the politically divided kingdoms of Europe, they faced a native population that was numerous, knew the land, and was united in its opposition to these strange new intruders. The Vikings, who had succeeded as a minority, elite in England and Russia, could not sustain a foothold in a land where they were so vastly outnumbered and so far from home. They sailed away, and Vinland faded from reality into saga. It became a story told in the longhouses of Iceland and Greenland, a heroic but distant memory. For centuries the wider world dismissed it as a mere myth. But in 1960, at a place called Land's O Meadows, on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, archaeologists unearthed the remains of a small Norse settlement. They found the turf walls of longhouses, a forge for working iron, and artifacts of unmistakably Viking origin. They had found life's buffer. They had found the physical proof of the sagas. They had found the sun-struck shore where the Vikings, for a brief, shining moment, had stepped into a new world, 500 years before Columbus would even be born. At the heart of the Viking Age, at the center of every raid, every conquest, and every voyage of discovery, stands the individual warrior. His image is one of the most potent and enduring in all of history, a figure of savage fury and raw power. Often clad in leather and horns, a berserker lost to a mindless rage. This image, a product of Victorian fantasy and Hollywood invention, is both a caricature and a profound underestimation. The real Viking warrior was a far more complex and formidable figure. He was a product of a society that glorified warfare, a master of his weapons, a disciplined soldier when he needed to be, and at times a vessel for a terrifying battle fury that even his own people found unsettling. To understand the Viking Age, we must understand the man who made it possible. We must look past the myth and see the warrior as he truly was. Let us begin by dispelling the most persistent myth of all, the horned helmet. There is not a single shred of archaeological evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets into battle. They are a romantic invention conceived in the 19th century to make them appear more demonic and pagan. The real Viking helmet was a masterpiece of brutal functionality. The most common type was the conical Spangenhelm, made from segments of iron riveted together, or the simpler, rounded Norman-style helmet that would dominate European battlefields for centuries. It was typically unadorned, designed for one purpose: to deflect a sword blow or a glancing axe strike. Wealthier chieftains might have a more elaborate version, a spectacle helmet with guards around the eyes and a mail curtain or aventail to protect the neck. But for the vast majority, a simple iron bowl with a nasal guard was the height of head protection. It was practical, effective, and utterly devoid of horns. His body armor, too, was a matter of wealth and status. The iconic image of a warrior clad in a mail byrnie, a shirt of thousands of interlocking iron rings, was a reality only for the elite. A mail shirt was astronomically expensive, the equivalent of a luxury car today, representing years of a blacksmith's painstaking labor. It was a chieftain's garb, a symbol of power and prestige, and it offered superb protection against cutting blows. For the average free farmer, the carl, who formed the backbone of any Viking army, such an expense was impossible. His protection was far simpler: a thick, padded leather jerkin or a tunic of heavy, felted wool, which could offer surprising resistance to a blade. For many, their only real piece of armor was courage and the shield they carried on their arm. His primary piece of defensive equipment, and his most versatile, was his shield. It was large and round, about 1 meter in diameter, constructed from wooden planks glued together. It was not heavy or cumbersome, but light and maneuverable. The front was often covered with leather or painted with bold, geometric designs. At its center was a domed iron boss, designed to protect the hand that gripped a wooden bar behind it. The shield was the warrior's constant companion. It was used to deflect blows, to catch arrows, and in the hands of a skilled fighter, as an offensive weapon, the iron boss could be slammed into an opponent's face in a brutal shield punch. Most importantly, it was the key component of their signature battle tactic, the shield wall. The Viking's choice of weapon was a reflection of his social standing. The most common weapon on the battlefield was the spear. It was cheap to make, requiring little iron and incredibly effective. It gave the warrior reach, allowing him to strike at his enemy from a safe distance, and it could be used to thrust from the safety of the shield wall or thrown as a deadly projectile. Nearly every Viking warrior would have carried a spear. The axe, however, is the weapon most associated with the Vikings, and for good reason. It was a universal tool. Every farm had an axe for felling trees, so every farmer had a weapon. In battle, these were supplemented by specialized fighting axes. The most feared of all was the Great Dane axe. This was not a one-handed weapon, but a brutal, two-handed polearm with a long wooden shaft and a massive broad head. Its beard or lower edge was swept back, creating a hook that could be used to pull away an enemy's shield or leg. In the hands of a strong warrior, a Dane axe could split a shield, cleave through a helmet, or kill a horse with a single blow. It was a weapon of pure shock and terror. The sword was the weapon of the aristocracy. A Viking sword was a thing of both beauty and lethality. It was a straight, double-edged blade, designed primarily for slashing. The blades themselves were often works of art, created through a process called pattern welding, where rods of iron and steel were twisted and forged together, creating beautiful watery patterns on the surface of the metal. These swords were incredibly valuable, passed down from father to son as heirlooms. They were given names Leg Biter, Sea King's Flame, Foe Reaper, and were imbued with their own history and personality. To own a sword was to be a man of importance. To lose one in battle was the ultimate disgrace. On the battlefield, these individual warriors did not fight as a disorganized mob. They were disciplined soldiers who understood the power of formation. Their primary tactic was the skjoldborg, the shield wall. Warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their shields to create a solid, interlocking barrier of wood and iron. The front rank would present a hedge of spear points, while the ranks behind would add their weight, making the wall nearly impossible to break by a frontal charge. A battle between two Viking armies was often a monstrous, grinding, shoving match between two shield walls, each trying to exhaust and break the other. It was a test of stamina, discipline, and collective will. Into this stalemate they might unleash their offensive formation, the Sven-Fylking, or bore snout a wedge of elite warriors designed to charge and punch a hole in the enemy line, creating chaos that could be exploited. And then there was the fury. Within this disciplined framework existed a phenomenon that terrified their enemies and fascinated their poets, the berserker. The sagas speak of warriors who, before a battle, would enter a terrifying trance-like state. They were the berserkir, the bear shirts, or the elfhenner, the wolf coats. They were said to howl like wild animals, bite the iron rims of their shields, and fight with a reckless, ecstatic fury, seemingly impervious to pain or wounds. Clad only in the skins of their totem animal, they would cast aside their shields and charge into the enemy ranks, wielding their weapons with unstoppable force. The source of this berserker gang remains a mystery. Scholars have proposed countless theories. Was it induced by hallucinogenic mushrooms like the fly agaric? Was it a result of consuming vast amounts of alcohol before a fight? Or was it a form of psychological conditioning, a self-induced hysteria, or battle frenzy, perhaps connected to warrior cults dedicated to the god Odin, the master of ecstasy and fury? The most likely explanation is a combination of factors, a ritualistic process, possibly involving intoxicants that tapped into a primal battle rage, a form of shock therapy for the battlefield. Whatever its cause, the berserker was a potent psychological weapon. Their role was likely to be shock troops, held back and then unleashed at a critical moment to shatter enemy morale and break their line through sheer, terrifying ferocity. The Viking warrior was, therefore, a contradiction. He was a disciplined soldier who could lock shields with his comrades and hold a line for hours. He was also capable of a terrifying individualistic fury that bordered on the supernatural. He was a farmer, a trader, and a poet, but when he went Viking, he became a professional killer, equipped with brutally effective weapons and a mindset that embraced death and battle as a glorious end. He was the engine of the Viking Age, a complex and formidable human weapon, forged in the cold of the north and unleashed upon a world that was utterly unprepared for his arrival. An age does not end like a story. There is no final page to turn, no neat conclusion. An age fades like a long northern sunset, its colors slowly deepening and darkening until they merge with the twilight, leaving behind a changed landscape. The Viking Age, that storm of fire and steel that had erupted from Scandinavia, did not end in a single cataclysmic battle. It ended in 1,000 undramatic moments, in a baptismal font, in a marriage bed, in a farmer's decision to mend a fence. Rather than sharpen an axe, the fury of the Northmen did not vanish. It was tamed, transformed, and absorbed into the very fabric of the Europe it had once terrorized. The Viking became the Norman, the Russ, the English lord. The longship was moored for the last time, not in defeat, but because its journey was finally over. The most powerful force of this transformation was not a sword, but an idea, Christianity. In the early centuries, the paganism of the Norse had been a source of their terrifying strength. Their belief in Valhalla and a glorious death in battle gave them a psychological edge over their Christian victims, for whom death was a matter of judgment and salvation. But as the Vikings began to settle in the lands they had conquered, this dynamic shifted. They were no longer raiders. They were rulers, neighbors, and farmers. They were a pagan minority living in a sea of Christianity. In England. The process began with Alfred the Great's brilliant act of statesmanship at Edington. By forcing the Viking warlord Guthrum to accept baptism, Alfred did more than just secure a temporary peace. He brought his enemy into his own world. In the decades that followed, as Alfred's successors, Edward the Elder and Athelstan, began the slow, arduous process of reconquering the Danelaw, they found a population whose Norse identity was already blurring at the edges. The Viking settlers had intermarried with the local Anglo-Saxons. They lived side by side, farming the same land, trading in the same markets. Norse names mingled with English ones. The worship of Thor and Odin began to give way to the worship of the White Christ. When King Athelstan finally shattered a combined Norse and Scottish army at the epic Battle of Brunanburh in 937, he was not just conquering a foreign land. He was consolidating a new Anglo-Scandinavian England. The Viking spirit was being woven into the English tapestry. An even more dramatic transformation occurred in Francia. In the year 911, the West Frankish king, Charles the Simple, was at his wits' end. A powerful Viking army under a formidable chieftain named Rollo was relentlessly ravaging the lands of the lower Seine. Charles, unable to defeat Rollo in battle, offered him a deal that would change the course of European history. He would grant Rollo and his men the entire territory they occupied, the land that would become known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In exchange, Rollo had to do two things. He had to defend the kingdom from any future Viking attacks, and he had to be baptized. Rollo agreed. This was a masterstroke of geopolitical alchemy. The Franks had turned their greatest poacher into their most effective gamekeeper. Rollo and his men became the shield of Francia, but the transformation went deeper. These Vikings, now landed aristocrats, did something remarkable. They embraced their new identity with a ferocious energy. They abandoned their Norse language and adopted French. They abandoned their pagan gods and became zealous Christians, building monasteries and churches with the same vigor they had once used to burn them. Within a few generations, they had become the Normans, a new and potent force in Europe, defined by a unique fusion of Viking audacity and Frankish feudal discipline. They were no longer Vikings, but they had lost none of their ambition or martial prowess. They were a time bomb of Viking energy, ticking away on the coast of France. This process of assimilation abroad was mirrored by a profound change at home, in the Scandinavian heartland itself. For centuries, Scandinavia had been the pagan wellspring of the Viking Age, but by the 10th and 11th centuries, the kings of the newly consolidating kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden saw that to be a part of the wider European world, too, be treated as equals by the emperors and popes of the south, they had to adopt the religion of that world. The conversion of Scandinavia was often a brutal, top-down affair, driven by political ambition as much as by genuine piety. In Denmark, King Harold Bluetooth, in the mid-10th century famously erected a massive rune stone at Gelling. One face of the stone depicts a roaring lion, the other a crucified Christ. The inscription proudly proclaims that Harold was the king who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. This was conversion as a statement of royal power, a declaration that Denmark was now a modern, unified Christian kingdom. In Norway, the process was even more violent. Olaf Tryggvason, who seized the throne at the end of the 10th century, was a convert of ferocious zeal. He moved through the kingdom with his army, offering the local chieftains a stark choice: baptism or death. His successor, Olaf Haraldsson, continued this policy, and though he was defeated and killed in battle, his legacy as the king who unified and Christianized the nation earned him sainthood. Saint Olaf became the patron saint of Norway, and the old gods were driven into the shadows. The warrior ethos of Valhalla was slowly but surely replaced by the moral framework of the Church. With this change, the ideological fuel for the Viking Age, the glory of raiding for wealth and fame, was finally exhausted. The homelands were no longer exporting Vikings. They were exporting Christian soldiers, kings, and priests. The political landscape had changed as well. The very instability that had propelled the first Vikings out of their fjords, the landless younger sons, the exiled jarls, had been resolved. By the 11th century, Scandinavia was no longer a fractured land of petty chieftains. It was home to three powerful, organized kingdoms. These new monarchies had centralized governments, national taxes, and professional armies. Warfare was no longer a freelance enterprise for private profit. It was the business of kings directed against other kings for strategic goals. The age of the opportunistic raid was over. The age of national warfare had begun. The final, dramatic act of the Viking Age was played out in the year 1066, a year of destiny that saw all these threads converge. The throne of England fell vacant, and three powerful men claimed it. One was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England. The second was William, the Duke of Normandy, the direct descendant of the Viking Rollo, a French-speaking Christian knight who ruled a state built on Viking foundations. The third was Harold Sigurdsson, King of Norway, a man known to history as Harald Hardrada, Hard Ruler. Hardrada was the ultimate Viking adventurer, a man who seemed to have stepped directly out of a saga. As a young man, he had been exiled from Norway, traveled the river road to Kiev, and then on to Constantinople, where he became the commander of the elite Varangian Guard. He had fought and plundered his way across the Mediterranean, amassed an incredible fortune, and returned home to seize the throne of Norway. He was the last great Viking, the embodiment of the old spirit of the Sea King. When he learned of the succession crisis in England, he saw one last great opportunity for a Viking conquest. He assembled a massive invasion fleet and sailed. For England, he landed in the north and shattered the first English army sent against him. He was on the verge of conquering the old kingdom of Northumbria. But Harold Godwinson, the English king, was a brilliant general. In a stunning feat of speed and logistics, he force-marched his army nearly 200 miles north in just 4 days. He caught the Norwegian army completely by surprise at a place called Stamford Bridge. The Norwegians were relaxing, many of them not even wearing their mail shirts. The battle that followed was a bloodbath. Legend tells of a single giant Norwegian axeman who held the bridge alone against the entire English army until he was finally brought down from below. But the result was a decisive English victory. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking, was struck in the throat by an arrow and killed. His death on an English bridge was the symbolic death of the Viking Age. The old way of the Sea Kings was over, but the story of 1066 was not yet finished. As Harold Godwinson celebrated his victory, he received the news he had been dreading. William of Normandy had landed his army on the south coast. Harold was forced to march his exhausted army all the way back down the length of England to face this new threat. On a hillside near the town of Hastings, the two armies met. It was a clash of two Viking legacies. Harold's English army, with its corps of elite housecarls wielding Great Dane axes, fought in the classic Viking style of the shield wall. William's Norman army, with its devastating cavalry charges and disciplined archers, represented the evolution of that Viking spirit, fused with Frankish feudalism. For an entire day, the English shield wall held firm, unbreakable. But as evening fell, a desperate charge led by William finally broke the line. Harold Godwinson was struck by an arrow in the eye and cut down. The battle was over. William the Conqueror had won the throne of England. It is a profound and beautiful irony. The Viking Age began with the raid on Lindisfarne, an attack on England by pagan Northmen. It ended 273 years later at the Battle of Hastings, with the conquest of England by the Christianized, French-speaking descendants of those very same Northmen. The raiders had become kings. The Vikings had not been defeated. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had conquered England, reshaped France, founded Russia, and discovered a new world. Their blood flows in the veins of tens of millions. Their words pepper our language. Their spirit of relentless exploration, daring ambition, and fierce independence was not extinguished. It was simply poured into new vessels. The longship had finally come to shore, its crew disembarking not as raiders, but as the builders and rulers of the world to come. The long sunset was over, and a new day had dawned. And so the dragon ships sail into the mists of memory, their voyage is complete. Our journey through the Viking Age comes to a close, but the story of the Norsemen does not truly end. It echoes down through the centuries, a powerful undercurrent in the flow of Western history. To remember them only as brutal raiders is to see but a single facet of a complex and brilliant jewel. They were, without question, violent and terrifying to their victims. They ushered in an age of fear that reshaped the political and social landscape of Europe. But they were so much more. They were the most ambitious explorers of their time, pushing the boundaries of the known world not just for plunder, but for land, for freedom, for the simple, enduring human desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. They settled the harsh wilderness of Iceland, creating a unique republic and a literary tradition that preserved their sagas for all time. They pushed on to Greenland, clinging to life on the edge of the inhabitable world, and they reached the shores of North America, Vinland, 5 centuries before Columbus, a feat of navigation and courage that still staggers the imagination. They were master traders and city builders. From Dublin to Kiev, they established vital hubs of commerce that linked the silver of the Caliphate with the furs of the north and the markets of Byzantium. They were adapters, assimilating into the cultures they conquered, becoming the Normans. Of France, the Rus of Russia, the lords of England. They changed, and they were changed by the world. The coming of the cross did not erase their spirit, but transformed it, channeling their energy into the building of nations and the Crusades. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of our modern world. It lives in the DNA of millions across Europe and beyond. It survives in our language in words like berserk, law, sky, and window, and in the names of our days of the week. It exists in the political boundaries they helped to draw and the nations they helped to forge. The Viking Age ended, but the Viking spirit, that restless, daring, and indomitable drive to explore, to build, and to leave a name that will never be forgotten, that spirit endures. Thank you for joining me on this long voyage tonight. May your rest be peaceful, and your dreams be filled with the faint, distant sound of oars pulling through the dark water.